Life on Ebenezer Mission occurred in a very deliberately planned environment, which was intended to facilitate the assimilation of its residents into British colonial society. The outlay of the mission was modelled on a European congressional town, with the church as the main focus of the town in the centre. This landscape, described by archaeologist Jane Lydon as a culturally specific imagined geography that privileged observation and spatial order, was intended by the missionaries to introduce residents to a new understanding of social and spatial dynamics. Moravian values were both introduced and imposed on the residents. The separation between buildings and landscape, and the introduction of material culture, such as English furniture, was meant to show the difference between land use and wilderness, the civilized and uncivilized, so to speak. Moravian social structures were introduced through discrete living and sleeping spaces that separated individuals by age, gender, and marital status, as thought appropriate by the missionaries. The relationship between the missionaries and residents was certainly amicable at first. As residents began to adopt the lifeways and practices that were expected of them, they were often found working hand in hand with the missionaries, the men together in the workyard and on nearby stations, and the women working in the mission house undertaking domestic chores. Moravian values placed an emphasis on the importance of labour, and as such this activity was of importance to both the residents and missionaries alike. Nevertheless, the relationship between the two groups was not without difficulty, and the Moravians often expressed their frustrations at what they saw was a lack of progress. Camp lifestyles were still practiced on the mission, and archaeological evidence of cultural practices such as tree scarring and traditional subsistence strategies suggests that residents of Ebenezer continued to view the landscape around them as they always had. Indeed, a 1998 archaeological survey of the lower Wimmera River, which is close to Ebenezer and shares the land reserve, actually showed an increase in Indigenous activities during the period. Of course, a big part of this was simply the incongruity between European worldviews and Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. Now, the importance of spirituality in connection to country for Indigenous societies cannot be overstated. In an examination of the role of cultural heritage and Indigenous well-being, a New South Wales government report in 2006 found that Indigenous respondents to a focus group held in Redfern identified spirituality to be the most determinative factor in their physical, emotional, spiritual, and economic health. There can be little doubt of spirituality's similar importance to the past residents of Ebenezer and other missions, as well as the adverse effects that would have been brought about by attempts to extinguish it. However, in spite of attempts to do so by successive governments and missionaries, complex cultural systems of kinship and connection to country that were developed over 60,000 years were far more resilient than what the British presumed at the time. And for anybody interested in looking further into an example of one such cultural system from the Barunga Wugula community, I'd recommend reading Professor Claire Smith's brilliant book, Country, Kin and Culture. Now, nevertheless, mission life did have an effect on connection to kin and country. This effect was further exacerbated with the passing of the Aborigines Act in 1886, which was a legislative tool used to separate so-called full-blood and half-caste Aborigines from each other. When the Act came into effect, many of Ebenezer's residents had to leave the property. Those of mixed descent who had originally been forced into mission life were pushed out into a colonial society that still didn't accept them, all while dealing with being even further removed from their own culture and their own heritage.